She was invisible. Just another waitress in a room full of sharks, wiping down mahogany tables, while men with net worths higher than small countries laughed about destroying companies. They saw a uniform. They saw a servant. What they didn't see was the mind that could calculate a mate in 7 while balancing a tray of crystal flutes. Preston Valcourt, the city's most ruthless venture capitalist, thought he was just inviting a poor girl to play a game for his own amusement. He thought he was the predator. He was wrong. When the first pawn moved, the billionaire didn't realize he had just sat down across from his executioner. The rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Cobalt Room, Manhattan's most exclusive members-only club. It was a fortress of solitude for the elite, a place where the air smelled of aged leather, Cuban tobacco and old money. Sophie Hart adjusted her apron, wincing slightly. Her cheap black flats had worn through at the heel, and the blister rubbing against her skin was a sharp, rhythmic punishment with every step she took. She was 23, invisible, and currently holding a tray of empty tumblers that was heavier than it looked. "More ice, darling, and try to be faster this time," a voice drawled from the corner booth. It was Preston Valcourt. Sophie didn't look him in the eye. Rule number 1 of the Cobalt Room. You serve, you disappear. Yes, Mr. Valcourt, immediately. Preston Valcourt was 35 handsome, in a way that suggested he paid a team of people to keep him that way, and richer than God. He made his fortune in aggressive takeovers, stripping beloved family businesses down for parts and selling the scraps. He sat in a high-backed velvet armchair, a custom-made chessboard made of obsidian and ivory resting on the table before him. He was alone tonight. That was rare. Usually he was surrounded by sycophants, men like Arthur Pendergast or the oil baron Duke Reynolds. But tonight the storm had snarled traffic across the bridge, and the club was nearly empty. Sophie returned with the ice bucket, placing it silently on the coaster. She lingered for a fraction of a second too long, her eyes darting to the board. White to move. The position was messy. Valcourt was playing against himself, or rather he was replaying a famous game from 1958. But he had the knight on the wrong square. It was a positional error that would cost White the center in 3 moves. "Something on your mind?" Preston asked, not looking up. He twirled a black bishop between his fingers. Sophie froze. "No, sir. Just admiring the set. It's beautiful." Preston finally looked up. His eyes were a cold, piercing blue, devoid of warmth but full of a sharp, predatory intelligence. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's 18th century ivory. Worth more than your life's earnings, I imagine." He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "I'm bored and my usual whipping boys are stuck in traffic." "Do you know how the pieces move?" Sophie clutched her serving tray against her chest like a shield. I know the basics, sir." "Sit," Preston commanded. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. "I can't, sir. The manager Henry, he'll fire me if I own the building Henry leases," Preston interrupted, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid. "If I tell you to sit, you sit. If Henry complains, I'll buy the club and fire him. Now, sit." Sophie hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was dangerous. Men like Preston Valcourt played with people like they were toys. If she bored him, she'd be fired. If she offended him, she'd be blacklisted from every high-end venue in the city. She set the tray down on a side table and lowered herself into the plush leather chair. It was soft, swallowing her exhausted frame. It felt like a trap. Preston chuckled a low, dry sound. "Don't look so terrified. We're just going to kill some time. I'll even give you a handicap. I'll take my queen off the board." He reached out to remove the white queen. "That won't be necessary," Sophie said softly. Preston paused, his hand hovering over the piece. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the frayed collar of her uniform, the messy bun of dark hair, the tired shadows under her eyes. "Excuse me, you don't need to remove the queen," Sophie said, her voice steadying. "It wouldn't be a fair game." Preston threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, barking sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Oh, this is rich. The waitress has pride. Very well, darling. Keep the queen. I'll try not to end it in 4 moves. I'd hate to make you cry before you bring me a refill." He gestured for her to take the black pieces. "Ladies first." "No, that's not the rule. But I'm a gentleman. You make the first move." Sophie looked at the board. For the last 3 years, she had been scrubbing floors and serving drinks to pay for her mother's medical bills. She had buried her past. She had buried the little girl who used to play blindfold Simul on park benches in Washington Square Park. She had buried the daughter of Victor the Wolf Kovac, the disgraced Grand Master who vanished 10 years ago. But looking at the ivory pieces, the hunger woke up. She reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and pushed her pawn to e5. "Standard," Preston sneered, moving his pawn to e4 immediately. "Let's see if you can keep up." The first 10 moves were a blur of speed. Preston played aggressively, slapping his pieces down with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. He played a flashy attacking opening, sacrificing a pawn early to open up lines toward her king. It was the style of a bully intimidation over substance. He sipped his scotch, watching her over the rim of the glass. "You're surprisingly competent," he admitted, after she blocked his bishop's attack with a calm knight development. "Usually when I play the staff, they forget how the knight moves by turn 3. My father taught me a little." Sophie lied. She didn't mention that her father forced her to memorize the encyclopedia of chess openings before she could read English. "Cute," Preston muttered. He moved his queen out early, placing it on h5. A crude attempt at a scholar's mate setup, delayed and modified. He was testing her, mocking her. He wanted to see if she would panic at the sight of the most powerful piece on the board coming for her throat. Sophie didn't panic. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity wash over her. The noise of the rain faded. The throbbing in her feet vanished. There was only the 64 squares. She saw the flaw in his aggression instantly. By bringing his queen out so early, he had left his queen side undeveloped. His king was still in the center. "He thinks I'm prey," she thought. "He thinks I'm a mouse." Sophie moved her knight to f6, attacking his queen. Preston smirked. "Aggressive. I like feisty." He moved the queen to f3, keeping the pressure on. Sophie didn't hesitate. She pushed her d-pawn to d5, striking at the center. The rhythm of the game changed. Preston stopped sipping his drink. He leaned forward, his brow furrowing slightly. He had expected her to turtle, to build a defensive wall and pray for a draw. Instead, she was opening up the board. She was inviting chaos. "Careful," Preston warned, his voice dropping an octave. "You're leaving your king exposed." "Am I?" Sophie whispered. She sacrificed a bishop. It was a move so subtle, so seemingly stupid, that Preston actually snorted. "Darling, you just gave me a free piece." He captured the bishop with his pawn, shaking his head, and here I thought we were having a moment. "Look deeper," Sophie said. Preston paused. He looked at the board. He looked at the captured bishop. Then he looked at the open file she had just created. Suddenly his eyes widened. By taking the bishop, he had moved his pawn away from the defense of his king. He had opened the diagonal. Sophie moved her queen. Check. Preston swore softly and moved his king. Sophie moved her rook. Check. Preston's hand hovered over the board. His knuckles were white. He realized with a jolt of nausea that he was running out of squares. How he was Preston Volcourt. He had studied under Russian tutors. He was playing a waitress who smelled like dish soap and stale coffee. He moved his king again, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. Sophie reached out. She didn't slam the piece down. She placed it gently with the tenderness of a mother tucking in a child. "Checkmate," she said softly. The silence in the cobalt room was deafening. The rain continued to lash against the glass, but inside time seemed to have stopped. Preston stared at the board. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked for an escape. He looked for a rule she had broken. He replayed the last 5 moves in his head. It was a trap. A beautiful, complex, suffocating trap that he had walked right into, because he was too busy looking at her legs instead of her strategy. He looked up at her. His face was a mask of shock, slowly replaced by a flushing red anger. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm just the waitress, sir," Sophie said, standing up, "and I believe table 4 needs their check." She turned to leave her heart pounding in her throat. She had done it. She had humiliated him. She needed to get away before he exploded. "Stop!" Preston barked. Sophie froze. Preston stood up, knocking his expensive chair backward. It clattered loudly against the floor. He walked around the table, closing the distance between them. He loomed over her, smelling of expensive cologne and fury. "Nobody beats me," he hissed. "Especially not with a sacrifice like that. That was the Petrovsky variation. That hasn't been played in high-level play since the 90s. Where did you learn that?" Sophie kept her head down. "I read books, sir. Library books." Preston grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to hold her in place. "Don't lie to me. You didn't learn that from a library book. You played me. You hustled me." "I didn't hustle you," Sophie said, pulling her arm back. Her eyes flashed with a sudden spark of defiance. "You invited me. You mocked me. You lost. Let me go." Preston stared at her, breathing heavily. The anger in his eyes began to shift into something else. Curiosity. Obsession. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a money clip made of solid platinum. He peeled off a stack of $100 bills, more money than Sophie made in 3 months. He slammed the cash onto the table next to the chessboard. "Again?" he said. "I have to work," Sophie said, backing away. "I'll buy your shift," Preston snapped. "I'll buy your whole damn week. Sit down." "No," Sophie said. Preston blinked. He wasn't used to that word. "No, I beat you," Sophie said, her voice shaking but clear. "The game is over. I have tables to bus." She turned and walked away, leaving the billionaire standing alone in the middle of the room, the cash untouched on the table, staring at the checkmated king as if it were a ghost. But Preston Volcourt was not a man who let things go. As he watched Sophie disappear into the kitchen, he pulled out his phone. He dialed a number that didn't appear in any public directory. "It's Valcourt," he said into the phone, his eyes fixed on the kitchen door. "I need a background check. Full deep dive. Name is Sophie." "Wait." He realized he didn't even know her last name. He walked over to the table where she had left the check for the other customer. It was signed by the server. S. Hart. Sophie Hart, Preston said into the phone. Find out everything. Who she is, where she came from, and who taught her to kill a king in 20 moves. 2 days later, Sophie was fired. It happened quickly and brutally. Henri, the manager of the Cobalt room, called her into his office before her shift even started. He wouldn't look her in the eye. He mumbled something about restructuring and client complaints, handed her a final envelope of cash and told her to clear out her locker. Sophie knew better. She hadn't had any complaints. This was Valcourt. She walked out into the blinding afternoon sun of Manhattan, clutching her envelope. Panic began to set in. Her mother's dialysis treatment was due on Thursday. She had rent. She had nothing. She was standing on the corner of Fifth Avenue, checking her phone for other job listings, when a sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb. The back window rolled down. "Get in," Preston Valcourt said. He was wearing sunglasses, looking every bit the corporate shark. Sophie glared at him. "You got me fired." "I freed up your schedule," Preston corrected. "Get in, Sophie, unless you want to explain to your landlord why you're short this month." Sophie's blood boiled. She wanted to throw her phone at him. She wanted to scream. But she also thought of her mother. She opened the door and slid onto the cream-colored leather seats. The car smelled of new car scent and peppermint. Preston tapped the glass partition, and the driver merged seamlessly back into traffic. "You ruined my life," Sophie said flatly. "I'm offering you a promotion," Preston said. He handed her a thick file folder. Sophie opened it. It was a contract. "What is this?" "I have a problem," Preston said, taking off his sunglasses. "There is a man named Victor Cross. You know the name." Sophie's breath hitched. "Victor Cross, the current US champion. A man known for his robotic precision and his utter lack of empathy. Everyone knows Victor Cross. Cross and I have a rivalry," Preston explained. "Not in business, in ego. Every year there is a private tournament held in the Swiss Alps, the Obsidian Invitational, high stakes, $10 million buy-in. Winner takes the pot, but more importantly, the winner gets the key. The key. It's a symbolic trophy, but it grants access to a consortium of investors that Cross controls. If I win, I can hostile take over his entire empire. If I lose, he gains control of my Asian tech division." "So play him," Sophie said. "You seem to think you're good." Preston grimaced. It was a rare moment of vulnerability. "I'm good. He's a machine. I've lost to him 5 years in a row. Last year, he made me resign in front of the Saudi prince. It was unpleasant." He pointed a manicured finger at her. "But you play like a chaotic storm. You play like the old Soviet masters. You don't play by the book. You burn the book. Cross can predict algorithms. He can't predict you." Sophie looked at the contract again. The numbers were staggering. "I want to hire you," Preston said. "Not as a waitress, as a coach. A second, I want you to train me to beat Victor Cross. And if I say no, then you can go back to waiting tables at a diner in Queens, assuming I don't buy that diner and fire you from there too." Sophie looked at him with disgust. "You're a monster." "I'm a winner," Preston shrugged, "and I'm offering you $50,000 a month, plus a bonus of $500,000 if I win the tournament." $50,000. That would pay for a kidney transplant. That would pay off the debt her father left behind. I don't just want money, Sophie said quietly. What do you want? I want to play. Preston frowned. Excuse me, I don't want to just coach you, Sophie said, her eyes hardening. I want entry. I want to play in the tournament. Preston laughed. Sophie, the entry fee is $10 million, and it's by invitation only. You're a nobody. Then make me a somebody, she countered. Sponsor me. Pay my entry entry fee. If I win, you get the winnings. I just want the title. I want to beat Cross myself. Preston studied her. He saw the fire in her eyes. It was the same fire he saw in the mirror every morning. He realized then that she wasn't just a waitress who got lucky. She was a predator who had been declawed by life, desperate to hunt again. You think you can beat Victor Cross? Preston asked seriously. I know I can, Sophie said. I know his weakness. He doesn't have a weakness. He does, Sophie whispered. He can't handle imperfection. He panics when the board gets messy, and I make the board very, very messy. Preston smiled. A real smile this time. A wicked, conspiring smile. Deal, he said, extending his hand. But if you lose my $10 million, Sophie Hart, you will work for me for the rest of your life. For free. Sophie looked at his hand. She knew she was shaking hands with the devil. But for the chance to sit across from a grand master and show the world what she could do, she shook his hand. Where are we going? She asked. The airport, Preston said. We have a jet waiting. Training starts in Paris. Pack your bags. Actually, don't bother. I'll buy you new clothes. You look like a charity case. As the limo sped toward Teterboro Airport, Sophie watched the city blur past. She wasn't Sophie the waitress anymore. She was a player again. But she knew something Preston didn't. She wasn't doing this for the money. And she wasn't doing it just to beat Cross. She was doing it because Victor Cross was the man who had framed her father 10 years ago. And Sophie Hart was finally coming for revenge. The private jet touched down at Le Bourget in Paris under a blanket of twilight. Sophie stepped onto the tarmac, the cool French air biting at her cheeks. She expected to be whisked away to a hotel, but Preston Valcourt didn't do hotels. He owned a penthouse on Avenue Montaigne that overlooked the Eiffel Tower, a sprawling palace of glass and marble that cost more per night to maintain than Sophie's entire neighborhood in Brooklyn earned in a year. Welcome to boot camp, Preston said, tossing his jacket onto a pristine white sofa. For the next 3 weeks, Sophie didn't see the Eiffel Tower. She didn't see the Louvre. She saw only 64 squares. Preston had hired a team. There was a nutritionist who measured her caloric intake to ensure optimal brain function. There was a sleep specialist who adjusted the circadian rhythm of the room. And there was Claude, a stylist who looked at Sophie's worn-out sneakers with the same expression one might look at a dead rat. Burn it all, Preston ordered Claude, gesturing to Sophie's single battered suitcase. Wait, Sophie protested, grabbing the bag. My father's chess journal is in there. Preston paused. He walked over, gently took the bag from her and unzipped it. He bypassed the faded T-shirts and the toiletries stolen from the hotel. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and stained with coffee and time. He flipped through it. It was filled with frantic scribbles, diagrams of games and notes in Russian and English. It was the mind of a madman or a genius. We keep the book, Preston said, handing it back to her. Everything else goes. You are entering a world where appearance is a weapon, Sophie. If you look poor, they will treat you like you are stupid. I need you to look like a queen so you can kill like one. The transformation was grueling. Sophie was poked, prodded, tailored, and polished, but the real torture happened in the library. Preston wasn't just a billionaire. He was a decent player, rated around 2200. But he knew that wasn't enough to train her. He flew in sparring partners. Not just anyone. He brought in hungry international masters from Eastern Europe, men who played for rent money and hated losing. On the third day, a Serbian master named Goran sat across from her. He was a massive man, with hands like shovels smoking a cigar that Preston allowed only because Goran was brilliant. "Little girl," Goran grunted, moving his knight. "You should go back to dolls." Sophie didn't speak. She was wearing a silk blouse that cost $2,000, and it felt alien on her skin. But the pieces felt familiar. She played the Sicilian Defense Dragon variation. It was sharp, double-edged, and violent. Goran laughed at her aggressive pawn storm. He thought she was overextending. He launched a counterattack on the queen side. Preston watched from the corner, nursing an espresso. He saw what Goran missed. Sophie wasn't attacking to checkmate. She was attacking to force a mistake. 20 moves later, Goran was sweating. He loosened his tie. He realized his king was trapped in a mating net, and he had no pieces to defend it. "Resign?" Sophie whispered. Goran slammed his fist on the table, rattling the pieces. "No, it is a draw. Perpetual check." "It's mate in 3, Sophie said calmly. "Rook to h1. King takes. Queen to h5. Goran stared at the board. His face turned purple. He stood up, knocked his king over, and stormed out of the room, cursing in Serbian. Preston walked over to the table. He looked at the position. It was a work of art. "You have a temper on the board," Preston noted, sitting in the empty chair. "I hate bullies," Sophie said, resetting the pieces. "Is that what I am?" Preston asked. His voice was softer than usual. Sophie looked up at him. In the soft light of the Parisian apartment, the sharp angles of his face seemed less severe. He looked tired. The weight of his empire, the pressure of the upcoming tournament, it was wearing on him too. "You're a control freak," Sophie said. "But you gave me a chance. So the jury is out." Preston chuckled. He reached across the board, but instead of moving a piece, he brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her jawline for a second too long. The air in the room suddenly became very thin. Sophie's breath hitched. "You're not just a weapon, Sophie," Preston murmured. "I hope you know that. When we get to the Alps, they will try to tear you apart. Not just Cross, the press, the other billionaires. They eat weakness." "I'm not weak," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden proximity of him. "I know," Preston said. He pulled his hand back, the mask of the ruthless businessman sliding back into place. "But everyone has a breaking point. We leave tomorrow. Get some sleep. You're going to need it." He stood up and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. "And Sophie, that dress looks incredible on you." Sophie sat alone in the library, her heart pounding a rhythm that had nothing to do with chess. She touched her cheek where his fingers had been. She couldn't afford to fall for him. He was the employer. She was the employee. And she had a secret agenda. If Preston found out she was Viktor Kovac's daughter, he might pull her from the tournament. Her father's name was poison in the chess world. He was accused of using computer assistance in the 2014 World Championship cycle, a lie fabricated by Victor Cross to destroy him. Sophie opened her father's journal. On the last page in shaky handwriting were 3 words. Watch the F7 square. She closed the book. I'm coming for you, Cross, she whispered. The helicopter ride to the summit was terrifying. The hotel was built into the side of a jagged peak in the Swiss Alps, accessible only by air. It was a fortress of solitude for the ultra-rich, a place where deals were made that toppled governments and shifted economies. As the helicopter descended onto the private pad, snow swirled around the glass cabin. Sophie stepped out, wrapped in a white cashmere coat Preston had bought her. The cold was absolute, stripping the air from her lungs. "Showtime," Preston said, offering her his arm. He looked impeccable in a heavy wool trench coat, his eyes hidden behind aviator sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. They walked into the lobby. It was like entering a cathedral dedicated to wealth. A 40-foot fireplace roared in the center, surrounded by sofas made of reindeer hide. The air smelled of pine and money. The room was filled with men and women who radiated power. There was the tech mogul from Silicon Valley who had just bought an island. There was the Russian oligarch who owned half the natural gas in Europe. And in the center of them all, holding a glass of sparkling water, was Victor Cross. He was older than he looked in magazines. His hair was silver and perfectly coiffed, his suit cut so sharply it could draw blood. He was laughing at something a diplomat was saying, but his eyes were dead. They were the eyes of a shark moving through water. Preston tightened his grip on Sophie's arm. "Steady. He smells fear." They approached the circle. The conversation died as Preston Volcourt entered. "Preston," Cross said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. He didn't offer a hand. "I heard you were coming. I assumed you enjoyed losing your money so much last year. You came back for seconds." "I have too much money, Victor. It's a burden." Preston smiled tightly. "I need someone to help me lighten the load." Cross's gaze slid from Preston to Sophie. It was a physical violation. He scanned her from her boots to her eyes, analyzing her value, her threat level, her purpose. "And who is this?" Cross asked, sounding bored. "Another escort. Really, Preston, the staff quarters are in the basement." Preston's jaw clenched. Sophie felt the anger radiating off him. She stepped forward before he could speak. "I'm not an escort," she said, her voice cutting through the silence of the lobby. "I'm the player who is going to take your title." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Cross raised an eyebrow. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Is that so?" Cross asked. "You must be the prodigy my spies told me about. The waitress from Manhattan." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Let me give you some advice, little girl. Go back to serving drinks. This is a game for kings, not pawns." "Even a pawn can become a queen," Sophie retorted. Cross laughed. "A romantic notion, but in the real world, pawns get sacrificed." He turned his back on her, dismissing her completely. "Dinner is at 8, Preston. Try to teach your pet which fork to use." Preston steered Sophie away toward the check-in desk. His grip was bruising now. "You provoked him," Preston hissed as they entered the elevator. "He provoked me. He was testing you," Preston snapped. "He wanted to see if you would break, and you snapped at the bait. You cannot be emotional with him, Sophie. If you play him with anger, he will dismantle you piece by piece." They reached the penthouse suite. It was a sprawling, multi-level room with a panoramic view of the blizzard outside. Preston walked to the wet bar and poured a stiff drink. "I'm sorry," Sophie said, sitting on the edge of the bed. He just has that face." "He's a sociopath," Preston said, downing the drink. "But he's a genius sociopath. Listen to me. The drawing of lots is tonight at dinner. If you draw white against him, you have a chance. If you draw black, it will be a bloodbath." Sophie looked at her hands. They were trembling. Seeing Cross in person had shaken her more than she expected. It wasn't just anger. It was fear. He seemed larger than life, invincible. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Preston opened it. A hotel porter stood there, holding a small black box tied with a red ribbon. "For Ms. Hart," the porter said. "From Mr. Cross." Preston took the box and closed the door. He handed it to Sophie. "A mind game. Open it." Sophie untied the ribbon. She opened the box. Inside was a single chess piece. It was a black king. But it was broken. The cross on top had been snapped off violently. Underneath the piece was a note on heavy cream cardstock. "I know who you are, Sophie Kovacs. Your father was a fraud, and you are just the echo of his failure. Withdraw now, or I will ruin you, like I ruined him." Sophie dropped the note as if it were burning. Her face went pale. Preston picked up the note. He read it. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. He looked at Sophie. His expression was unreadable. "Kovac..." Sophie stood up, backing away. I didn't tell you because I thought you wouldn't sponsor me. My father is Victor Kovac, the Grand Master who was banned for cheating," Preston said flatly. "He didn't cheat," Sophie yelled, tears finally spilling over. "Cross framed him. Cross planted the device in his chair. My father died of a broken heart because of that man. I came here to prove he was innocent. I came here to destroy Cross." She waited for Preston to yell. She waited for him to fire her, to throw her out into the snow. She had lied to him from the start. Preston looked at the note, then at the broken king, and finally at Sophie. He walked over to her. He took her face in his hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. "Because I was afraid." "Sophie," Preston said, his eyes burning with a new intensity. "If I had known you were Victor Kovac's daughter, I would have paid you double." Sophie blinked. "What? Your father was the only man Cross ever feared," Preston said. "If you have his blood, then Cross is terrified. That's why he sent this. That's why he's threatening you. He's scared." Preston smirked, a dangerous, predatory look returning to his face. He crumpled the note and threw it into the fire. "He wants a war," Preston said. "Let's give him a war. Wipe your face. Put on the red dress. We're going to dinner, and you are going to smile at him like you know exactly how he's going to die." The dinner of wolves. The dining hall was lit by chandeliers made of antlers and crystal. The tables were set with silver that gleamed under the soft light. Sophie wore a crimson gown that hugged her figure, a stark contrast to the sea of black tuxedos. She felt like a target. Cross sat at the head of the table holding court. When Sophie and Preston entered, Cross's eyes flickered to her. He saw the red dress. He saw her chin held high. He didn't see the fear he expected. He frowned. The tournament director, a Swiss banker named Herr Vogel, tapped his glass. "Gentleman and lady," Vogel announced, "welcome to the Obsidian Invitational. The buy-in has been verified. The pot stands at $100 million. Winner takes all." A murmur of greed went through the room. "Tonight we draw the bracket," Vogel said. He held up a crystal bowl filled with ivory balls. One by one, the players drew their numbers. There were 8 players in total. It was a knockout tournament, 3 rounds to win. Sophie was the last to draw. She reached into the bowl, her heart hammering. She pulled out a ball. Number 8. Number 8, Vogel announced. Sophie Hart will play against number 1, Victor Cross. The room went silent. It was the worst possible draw. She would face the Grandmaster in the very first round. Cross smiled. He raised his wine glass to her. A short trip for you, my dear. I hope you didn't unpack. Sophie picked up her own glass. She stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she forced them to be still. She thought of her father, sitting in his dark apartment, replaying his lost games until he died. I didn't come for a trip, Victor, Sophie said, her voice ringing clear. I came to finish the game you started 10 years ago. She drank the wine. Preston squeezed her hand under the table. The game had begun. The tournament hall known as the Sanctum was a marvel of modern engineering designed to strip a human being of their soul. It was a soundproof glass cube, suspended in the center of the hotel's ballroom. Inside, the air was oxygen-enriched to keep the players awake, and the temperature was kept at a chilling 65 degrees. Outside the glass, 50 of the world's wealthiest people sat in darkness, watching the illuminated stage like Romans at the Colosseum. Sophie sat at the table. The board before her was made of polished obsidian and marble. The pieces were weighted with lead. Across from her, Victor Cross looked bored. He was checking his cuticles. He hadn't even looked at her since they sat down. 5 minutes to start, the arbiter announced. Preston was outside the glass, standing in the front row. He couldn't speak to her. He couldn't signal her. But Sophie could feel his eyes on her. Before she entered the cage, he had whispered one thing to her. Don't play the board. Play the man. He is arrogant. Use his ego against him. Sophie closed her eyes. She tried to summon the image of her father, Victor. She remembered him sitting at their wobbly kitchen table, cigarette smoke curling in the air. Chess is not about math. Sophie, he would say, it is about truth. You cannot lie on the board. If you are afraid, the board shows it. If you are greedy, the board punishes you. Begin, the arbiter said. Cross-playing white reached out and played. 1. D4. The queen's pawn. It was a solid, controlling opening. He wasn't trying to be flashy. He was planning to grind her down, to strangle her slowly until she suffocated. Sophie responded with the king's Indian defense. It was her father's favorite. It was risky. It allowed white to take the center, while black built a fortress and prepared for a counterattack. Predictable, Cross muttered loud enough for only her to hear. Your father played this against me in 2010. I crushed him in 30 moves. My father isn't here, Sophie said, keeping her voice steady. Just me. The game progressed. The silence in the glass cage was absolute. The only sound was the thwack of pieces hitting the board and the sharp click of the clock. By move 20, Sophie was in trouble. Cross was playing with machine-like precision. Every time she tried to create an imbalance, he shut it down. He traded pieces efficiently, simplifying the position. He was draining the life out of the game. He wanted a boring technical win. He wanted to show her that she didn't even deserve a fight. Sophie felt the sweat trickling down her spine despite the cold. Her heart rate monitor, displayed on a screen outside for the spectators to see, was spiking to 120. Cross's was a steady 65. She looked at the board. Her knight was pinned. Her king was trapped in the corner. If she moved her rook, she lost a pawn. If she didn't, she lost position. It was a slow death. Then she saw it. It wasn't a move on the board. It was a movement across the table. Every time Cross made a critical move, his eyes darted to the left. Just a flicker, a micro-expression. He would glance toward the reflection in the glass wall, then look back and move instantly. Sophie frowned. She followed his gaze. In the reflection of the glass, she could see the darkened audience. Specifically, she could see a man sitting in the third row. He was wearing a blue tie. He was tapping his finger against his chin. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Sophie's mind raced. It was Morse code. No too simple. Was it an engine evaluation? She looked back at the board. Cross made a move. Knight to e5. It was a brilliant, computer-perfect move that cemented his advantage. The man in the blue tie stopped tapping. A cold realization washed over Sophie. He's cheating, just like he did with her father. It wasn't a computer in the chair. It was a human engine in the audience, a grandmaster team, analyzing the game with a supercomputer in real time and signaling the best moves to him. The rage that exploded in Sophie's chest was hot and blinding. It wasn't fear anymore. It was pure molten hatred. He had destroyed her family, ruined her father's name, and here he was, doing the exact same thing to her. She looked at Cross. He was smirking. He knew she was suffering. Sophie looked out at the audience. She found Preston. She couldn't wave. She couldn't shout. But she stared at him, intense and desperate. She shifted her gaze to the man in the blue tie, then back to Preston, then back to the man in the blue tie. "See him," she begged silently. "Please, Preston. See what I see." Preston Valcourt was a shark. He made his billions by reading people, by noticing the tiny details others missed. He saw Sophie's distress. He saw her staring at the audience member. Preston turned his head slightly. He looked at the man in the blue tie. He saw the rhythmic tapping. He saw the earpiece the man was trying to hide under his hair. Preston's face went dark. He didn't make a scene. He didn't call the arbiter. That would pause the game, and Cross would just deny it. Preston stood up quietly. He buttoned his jacket. He whispered something to his bodyguard, a mountain of a man named Marcus. Marcus nodded and moved toward the man in the blue tie. Inside the cage, Sophie saw Preston move. She saw him give her a tiny, imperceptible nod. He knows. A wave of relief crashed over her, followed by a surge of adrenaline. She didn't have to win the game alone anymore. Preston was fighting the war outside the glass. She just had to fight the war inside. She looked back at the board. She was losing. The computer said she was down. 2.5 points. A dead loss against a grandmaster. But Cross was relying on the signals. What would happen if the signals stopped? Sophie took a deep breath. She reached out and made a move that made no sense to a computer. H5. She pushed a pawn on the side of the board. It did nothing for her position. It was an waiting move, a pass. Cross frowned. He looked at the board. He looked at the reflection. Outside, Marcus had reached the man in the blue tie. He didn't touch him. He simply sat down directly next to him, blocked his view of the stage with his massive shoulders, and leaned in to whisper something. The man in the blue tie went pale. He stopped tapping. He froze. Cross waited. He glanced at the glass. No signal. He glanced again. Nothing. Panic flickered in Cross's eyes. For the first time in 10 years he was alone. The voice of God in his ear had gone silent. He looked at the board. Why did she play h5? Was it a trap? Was there a deep tactical line he was missing? The computer wasn't telling him. He had to think. For the first time in the match, Victor Cross began to sweat. "Your move, Victor," Sophie said softly. "The clock is ticking." Cross hesitated. He was a strong player, yes, but he had become lazy. He had relied on the machine for so long that his intuition had atrophied. He stared at the complex mess of pieces in the center. Without the computer's guidance, the position looked terrifying. He played a passive move. Bishop to e2. A safety move. It was a mistake. Sophie saw it instantly. By retreating the bishop, he had unpinned her knight. The connection was broken. The beast was wounded. Sophie leaned forward. Her eyes, which had been filled with tears an hour ago, were now dry and sharp as diamonds. "Now," she whispered, "we play for real." She launched her knight into the center of the board. Knight to d4. A sacrifice. Cross stared at it. If he took the knight, her queen would infiltrate. If he didn't, she would fork his king and rook. He looked for the signal. The man in the blue tie was gone. Marcus was escorting him out of the ballroom. Cross looked at Preston. Preston was standing with his arms crossed, a cruel, satisfied smile on his face. He mouthed 2 words to Cross. "You're alone." Cross's hand trembled. He took the knight. Sophie slammed her queen to g5. Check. The rhythm of the game shifted violently. It was no longer a slow strangulation. It was a knife fight. Sophie played fast, banging the clock, forcing Cross to react on instinct. And his instinct was fear. He moved his king. She sacrificed a rook. The crowd outside gasped. Even the billionaires who didn't understand chess understood violence. They saw black pieces swarming the white king like hornets. Cross was hyperventilating. He had 15 minutes left. Sophie had 3. But she didn't need time. She had the truth. She remembered the game her father lost. The game that ruined him. It was this same position reversed, and Cross had used a computer to find the only escape. But Cross didn't have the computer. He moved his queen to defend. Queen to f1. "Wrong," Sophie said. She picked up her last remaining bishop. The piece felt heavy, like judgment. Bishop to h3. It was a quiet move. No check, no capture. Just a silent placement of the bishop on a square that dominated the king's escape route. Cross stared at the board. His eyes widened. He reached for his water glass, but his hand shook so badly he knocked it over. Water spilled across the obsidian table, soaking the expensive algebraic notation sheet. He calculated the lines. If he took the bishop, mate in 2. If he moved the pawn, mate in 3. If he sacrificed his queen, mate in 6. There was no escape. It was a zugzwang. Any move he made would lead to his death. Cross looked up at Sophie. His face was grey. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man who realizes his entire legacy is built on sand. "You're a witch," he hissed. "I'm a waitress," Sophie corrected. "And you are in checkmate." Cross didn't resign. He didn't shake her hand. He stood up his chair, screeching against the floor, and swept the pieces off the board with a violent sweep of his arm. The ivory and obsidian pieces clattered onto the glass floor, scattering like bones. "This is rigged," Cross screamed, his voice muffled by the glass but audible enough. "She cheated. I demand an investigation." The door to the glass cage hissed open. Preston Valcourt stepped in. He didn't look at Cross. He walked straight to Sophie. He offered her a hand to stand up. "Did you cheat?" Preston asked loudly for the room to hear. "I played to the board," Sophie said, standing tall. Preston turned to Cross. "My security team just apprehended a man named Mr. Grigori in the audience. He was transmitting moves to an earpiece. We have the device, we have the transmission logs, and we have his confession." The color drained from Cross's face completely. "You're finished, Victor," Preston said coldly. "The tournament is over. The investors know. The press is being briefed as we speak. You aren't just losing the 10 million. You're losing your company. You're losing your title. And you're going to prison." Cross looked around. The wealthy spectators were standing phones out, recording his downfall. The Shark Tank had turned on him. He slumped back into his chair, a broken king in a glass cage. Sophie didn't watch him fall. She turned to Preston. "Did we win?" she asked, her voice suddenly small, the adrenaline crashing. Preston looked at her with an intensity that melted the ice in the room. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. "You won, Sophie," he whispered into her hair. "You vindicated him. You did it." The aftermath was a blur of flashbulbs and lawyers. The scandal of the Obsidian Invitational rocked the world. Victor Cross was stripped of his Grandmaster title. The investigation revealed a decade of fraud, vindicating dozens of players he had destroyed, including Viktor Kovac. Sophie Hart became an overnight sensation. The waitress Grandmaster. Her face was on the cover of Time, Forbes, and Chess Life. But Sophie wasn't interested in the fame. 3 days after the tournament, she sat on the balcony of Preston's chalet, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise over the Alps. The snow was pink and gold in the morning light. On the table next to her was a check for $10 million. Preston walked out onto the balcony, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He sat down next to her. "You haven't cashed it yet?" he noted, nodding at the check. "It feels heavy," Sophie admitted. "I don't know what to do with it." "Well," Preston said, taking a sip of coffee. "You could buy a castle. You could buy your own chess club. You could buy the restaurant you used to work at and fire Henri." Sophie laughed. "That is tempting." "Or," Preston said, his voice turning serious, "you could invest it." "In what?" "In us." Sophie turned to look at him. "Us?" Preston set his coffee down. He took her hand. His skin was warm against the cold morning air. "I have a new project," Preston said. "I'm dissolving the venture capital firm. I'm tired of stripping companies. I want to build something. I want to start a foundation, the Kovac Foundation, chess schools for underprivileged kids, scholarships, training centers, and I want you to run it." Sophie's eyes widened. "You want to name it after my father?" "He deserves it," Preston said, "and the world deserves to know his name for something other than a lie." Sophie felt the tears pricking her eyes again. This man, this arrogant, ruthless billionaire, had given her everything. He had given her vengeance, he had given her pride, and now he was giving her a legacy. "And what about you?" Sophie asked. "What will you do?" "I'll be the chairman." Preston smirked. "Which means I get to boss you around. I'd like to see you try." Sophie smiled. "I beat Cross. You think I can't handle you?" Preston laughed. He leaned in close. "I'm counting on it." He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss like the one in Paris might have been. It was a kiss of equals. It tasted of coffee and victory. It was the end of the game and the beginning of a life. Sophie pulled back, breathless. She looked at the chessboard that was sitting on the table between them. The pieces were set up for a new game. "So," Sophie said, picking up a white pawn. "Do you want to play no stakes this time?" Preston smiled, his blue eyes sparkling with warmth. "Oh, Sophie. With us, there are always stakes." He reached out and covered her hand with his. "But I think I've finally found a game I don't mind losing." Sophie moved the pawn to e4. "Your move, Billionaire," she whispered. The sun climbed higher over the mountains, illuminating the board. The game continued, but this time nobody was alone. And that is the story of how a simple waitress checkmated a billionaire's heart and took down a tyrant. Sophie Hart proved that it doesn't matter where you start, whether it's a penthouse or a diner. What matters is the move you make when the world thinks you're defeated. She taught us that the most powerful piece on the board isn't the queen. It's the courage to keep playing when you're down. If you enjoyed this story of revenge romance and strategy, please smash that like button. It helps the channel so much. What would you do if a billionaire challenged you to a game for your life? Would you play? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. We have a thriller coming up next week about a thief who accidentally steals a nuclear code tattoo. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, make your next move your best move. See you next time.